Estamos en vivo.
Buenos días, les damos la bienvenida a todos. Buenos días, les damos la bienvenida a toda la audiencia a nuestra sexta semana de la pedagogía y segunda semana internacional de la pedagogía, que hemos titulado Preguntas contemporáneas de la pedagogía. Es un evento que en esta ocasión retoma la experiencia de la red de estudios en pedagogía, las actividades que hemos venido desarrollando desde el programa en pedagogía. Le voy a dar la palabra a la profesora Jamie Cárdenas, quien es vicerrectora académica de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional en Colombia, para que nos dé un saludo muy breve y comenzamos las actividades de este evento con la participación del profesor Gert Biesta, a quien le damos un cálido saludo y le agradecemos enormemente su disposición a acompañarnos en este evento.
Buenos días, profesor Gert Biesta, bienvenido. Me complace mucho saludar este espacio, la organización de estas jornadas de discusión, este ejercicio de pensamiento sobre las preguntas contemporáneas, algunas preguntas contemporáneas de la pedagogía. Exigen que primero hagamos un reconocimiento, un agradecimiento al comité organizador, a la profesora Luciana Machado de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Educación de la Universidad Nacional de Comahue de Argentina, Natalia Fatore de la Escuela de Ciencias de la Educación de la Facultad de Humanidades y Artes de la Universidad Nacional de Rosario, Argentina, a Blanca Flor Trujillo Reyes de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional de México, a José Leonardo Rolín de Lima Severo de la Universidad Federal de Paraíba, de Brasil, por supuesto a Cristina León, que año a año trabaja como hormiguita en la organización de estas jornadas, que ya estamos en la sexta versión de la Semana de la Pedagogía en la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional, y como ella lo indicó en la segunda internacional. Un saludo en general a la red de estudios en pedagogía. Quiero también aprovechar para saludar y agradecer a los invitados de lujo que tenemos en este evento académico, al profesor Bernard Charlot de la Universidad de París, Alejandra Virgin de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, Guillermo Bustamante de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional, Carmen Rodríguez del Consejo de Formación de Educadores de Uruguay, Adraline Marín de la Universidad Distrital, a Claudio Almer Dal Bosco de la Universidad de Paso Fundo de Brasil, y por supuesto al profesor Gert Biesta. Quiero saludar también a los profesores y estudiantes de las diferentes universidades que se vinculan a este evento académico, a todos los invitados y conectados gracias a las alianzas de universidades que se ocupan, que les interesa pensar estos temas de la pedagogía. Quiero solamente señalar que la sexta semana de la pedagogía, en su programación, sus propósitos, su orientación, da cuenta de un ejercicio que ha ido madurando en la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional de Colombia. Creo que nos estamos encontrando cada vez con un ejercicio más rico, más, digamos también, articulado, aliado, para seguir pensando qué es eso que nos delimita, que nos da existencia como campo a los que trabajamos desde la pedagogía, que nos permite también pensar qué implicaciones hay en términos de la formación, del desempeño profesional de quienes asumen hacer parte de una carrera en pedagogía. Para nuestra universidad este ejercicio de pensamiento es muy importante porque creo que no solamente nos permite situarnos en el lugar común de una universidad que se ocupa de formar educadores, especialistas en educación, sino también porque nos permite de otra manera aportar a pensar lo que en la sociedad hoy, a nivel local, pero también a nivel global, se están planteando como retos y desafíos para la educación. Me parece muy importante señalar que esa clave de lectura que se asume en esta Semana de la Pedagogía, desde la de preguntas contemporáneas, nos sirve justamente para interrogar, para repensar todo lo que estamos hoy situando en relación con un gran desafío marcado por la idea del cambio. En nuestra sociedad estamos viviendo la llegada de un gobierno que está planteando la importancia de dar un paso, de cambiar en lo que se requiere para poder dar la apertura a una paz total, y ahí por supuesto está comprometida la educación, ¿cierto? Pero siempre que se habla también de cambio, creo que desde la pedagogía se nos abren esas preguntas a propósito de las tensiones y de las complejidades sobre las cuales nos vivimos. Entonces, en buena hora, estas preguntas por la pedagogía desde la idea de lo contemporáneo, estoy segura nos van a ayudar a volver sobre las cuestiones fundamentales, ¿no? Las preguntas por la transmisión, por la enseñanza, por la tensión entre lo que se conserva, pero también se innova desde la educación, por las tensiones entre el aprendizaje y la enseñanza, y en últimas por todas esas confusiones que se generan en el campo de la educación y la pedagogía cuando vivimos siempre esos tiempos que ayuden al cambio y a la transformación. Entonces, en buena hora, bienvenidos, muchas gracias por este espacio, Cristina, colegas, muchas gracias al profesor Biesta, y seguramente vamos a quedar con muchas más preguntas para seguir pensando y asumiendo este bello riesgo de educar, como lo nombra el profesor Biesta en su libro, en el que nos aporta tantos elementos para seguir pensando en lo complejo que es asumir este trabajo en un campo de investigación y de práctica donde lo más cierto es lo singular, lo impensable. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos siempre a nuestra Universidad Pedagógica Nacional. Esperamos que esta sea una más de muchas jornadas que nos permitan seguir pensando estos temas fundamentales del campo de la pedagogía. Gracias, Cristina.
Muchas gracias a la profesora Jamie por esa introducción a nuestro evento. Quiero precisar para las personas que nos están acompañando en la plataforma de Zoom, pero también en la plataforma de YouTube, en la cual estamos haciendo la transmisión simultánea. Para quienes están acompañándonos en Zoom, en la parte inferior de la plataforma van a encontrar un icono en el que deben dar clic para habilitar la interpretación. Entonces allí hay algunas opciones si quieren escuchar la conferencia en su idioma original o si prefieren escuchar la traducción. Deben, por favor, habilitar esa opción. Para las personas que nos acompañan en YouTube van a escuchar la traducción en la conferencia, perdón, en su idioma original y posteriormente subiremos la traducción al español. Finalmente, en YouTube ubicamos en este momento el enlace para el vínculo con Zoom, por si alguno de ustedes está interesado en escuchar la traducción simultánea, se puede vincular a través de ese canal. Entonces, bueno, no voy a dar más preámbulos, estamos realmente complacidos de tener al profesor Gert Biesta en este encuentro, que como lo ha dicho la profesora Jamie, vincula los intereses de algunas personas, algunos colegas en América Latina que hemos venido pensando y estudiando la pedagogía, ocupados de la formación en programas de ciencias de la educación, programas de pedagogía, escuelas normales superiores y bueno, en nuestro caso en el programa en pedagogía en la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional, que es relativamente reciente. También le quiero pedir de verdad el agradecimiento al profesor Biesta por su generosidad en este espacio, pese a las dificultades horarias que tuvimos para dar inicio a esta sesión. Y bueno, voy a dar una presentación muy general y a darle la palabra. El profesor Gert Biesta es docente de la Universidad, del Centro de Educación Pública y Pedagogía de la Universidad de Maynooth en Irlanda. Enseña teoría de la educación y la pedagogía en la Escuela de Educación y Deporte de Murray House of the Universidad de Edimburgo en el Reino Unido, donde también es subdirector del Instituto de Educación, Enseñanza y Liderazgo. Ha trabajado en otras universidades en el Reino Unido, como la Universidad de Brunel, en Luxemburgo, Países Bajos, Leiden, entre otras. Ha sido editor y coeditor de la revista Studies in Philosophy and Education, British Education and Research Journal, Asia Pacific Journal of Teacher Education y editor asociado de Educational Theory. Sus estudios profesionales están vinculados al campo de la educación, en teoría e historia de la educación, en la Universidad de Leiden, en filosofía, en el área de filosofía de las ciencias sociales, de la Universidad de Erasmo de Rotterdam. Su doctorado lo cursa en la Universidad de Leiden. Bueno, entre algunas de sus investigaciones han sido objetos de trabajo la teoría de la educación y la filosofía, la teoría y filosofía de la investigación educativa y social, la política educativa, en especial en lo que tiene que ver con educación de adultos y aprendizaje permanente, en temas vinculados a la formación del profesorado. Ha publicado extensamente sobre estos temas en artículos, capítulos, libros. Hasta ahora su trabajo ha aparecido en 20 idiomas. Entre sus obras más reconocidas se encuentran El bello riesgo de educar, Cada acto educativo es singular y abierto al improviso, de 2017, Investigación educativa, una introducción poco ortodoxa, del 2020, Redescubrir la enseñanza, del 2022, y bueno, World Centered Education, A View for the Present, del 2022, que es el texto sobre el cual versará buena parte de su presentación de hoy. Así que, profesor Biesta, bienvenido. Muchas gracias por aceptar esta invitación y bueno, lo escuchamos.
Okay, thanks very much for that introduction, and hello to everyone, and apologies I was a bit late, but I think I made a mistake in the time zone, but here we are. Using Zoom, which I think many of us have become used to during the pandemic, and although it's different from being together in a room, it still makes a lot possible. So let's see what we can manage to do. Thanks, first of all, for allowing me to speak in English. And I hope that we can work across languages, and also thanks for the translation that's going on. And thanks for the invitation. When I received the invitation with a lovely email to contribute to a pedagogy week, I got very excited, because quite often I struggle to get 1 hour for pedagogy, and to have a whole week that focuses on that, I think it's very special. So I think I said yes quite quickly, and here we are. I've prepared a presentation, and after that we have some time for questions and comments. I will use a PowerPoint with quite a lot of text on it, but I hope that also helps with working across the languages. And I'll just get my PowerPoint up. Yeah, there is the button. And there it is. And I hope that the technology keeps working, but let me know if something goes wrong somewhere. I have this title, The Misunderstanding of Education. And I think that title speaks to what I just said about pedagogy, and in Spanish, pedagogía. I imagine it's pronounced a bit like that, which is for me also a very important word, because I grew up in the Netherlands, where we have a similar word, Pedagógica. I studied a lot of German scholars, where there is the word pedagogic. And when I moved to England about 23 years ago, I suddenly found that this word didn't really exist in English. You can use the word pedagogy, but it means something very different from what those words mean from my background. And there you can already begin to ask this question when we talk about education. Do we know what we are talking about? And also, are we talking about what we should be talking about? And that is roughly the idea behind what I want to share with you today. An exploration, as I put it here, of what education really is and what education really is about. And of course, that's always a bit risky to say it's really this, because other people might say, well, we think it's really that, and before you know it, you are arguing. But what I'll try to do is, in a careful way, to make a case for a very particular and, in my view, very important understanding of education that I think connects much better to countries that have this notion of pedagogia. And then I will ask what it means if we approach education in that way. I do that in response to all kinds of developments that I think are going on in many countries, and I'm partly curious what's happening in the countries you are from. But I also see that there are these global trends that are happening everywhere, where you can say that when you look at a particular level at what people think education is and what education should be, you see a lot of policymakers and a lot of reports on education and a lot of research that says education is about producing learning outcomes that we can measure. Education is about teachers using evidence-based interventions. Education should be based on the latest research, and some people get very excited where they say, if we use neurological research, then we can solve all problems in the classrooms. People then say, we all do this to get high scores and high positions in PISA rankings and similar comparative systems. And out of that, when you begin to look at the whole world of education, you see two important trends. One is that there is a lot of competition where countries try to be better than other countries, which I think is a strange idea. And also where a lot of these efforts are trying to get education under control in some way, with more evidence, more research, more money, more measurement, and so on. People think that that is fantastic and that that is the future we should be aiming for. I am not one of those people. I worry about all these trends that narrow what meaningful education is, that have a very technical view about the teacher, and that also, I think, miss the point of what education really is about. There was a speech from a Minister of Education in Australia a couple of months ago who said that the first task for everyone in education is to make sure that Australia returns to the top 5 of best performing education countries in the world. And I don't understand that. And in a sense, I think it's a scandal if an education minister says this is the main ambition for all education. Because I do not believe that Australian teachers or teachers anywhere in the world would go to their work in the morning with the idea that their job is to push their country in the top of a league table. Their first responsibility is to make sure that there is good, wonderful, meaningful education for the students they meet. And I think all the measurement and all the competition and control are a distraction, and I often worry that it puts education on, I use a song title from the Talking Heads here, a road to nowhere. And for me, this then begins to raise the big questions about what actually should education aim for, what should be on the horizon, what should be at the center of everything we try to do as educators, in schools, in colleges, universities, and in many other places where education takes place. So rather than all the measuring and all the competition, I tend to go back to very different ideas that I think keep us being aware of the important human and humane tasks we have to do as educators. I like this particular phrase from Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, who says our task as human beings is to try to be at home in the world. And I think that that is very appropriate, because the world can be a very difficult place to exist. And the world nowadays is pretty difficult for many people. But that doesn't mean that we can or should walk away from the world. The world is the place where we live our lives. So to try to be at home there, to try to stay there is a really big challenge. And I think that education is closely connected to this challenge. In a book I published last year, I make the point that the world is actually what should be at the center of all our educational endeavors. And in my presentation, I'll talk a bit around that idea. So by raising these questions, I am aware I'm raising really big questions, but I think education is such an important endeavor that we shouldn't be ashamed to ask these big, difficult, but really important questions. And if there is at least 1 week a year where we can ask these questions, I think that will help to keep it focused. So that by way of introduction, and I have a couple of steps in my talk, and I'll try to give you a sense of what the steps are. I begin with a very simple question, but I think a really important question for all of us educators. The question, does education matter? Does the work we do day in, day out with our students, does that work make a difference? And of course, then the question is, what kind of difference are we after? This is the fundamental question, because if we would say, actually, we cannot answer this question, then probably we should be honest and say, let's stop with our work. So we need to be able to give an answer to this question. Now, one author who raises this question in a fantastic and really fascinating way is a German professor of education, Dietrich Benner. And he asked the question in this particular way, and I'll show you a bit of his thinking, because I think he is really onto something. He asks the question, does education make a difference? But he asks it by saying, look, we know that we are living beings, we are natural beings, we are biological and developing beings. So we know that part of us is natural. We also know that we are cultural beings, we are beings who live in environments, and these environments have a big influence on us. So there is also a nurture component. And then he asks, and what about education? What's the contribution of education in relation to the nature part and the nurture part, or the social cultural part? It's an interesting question, and maybe you have ideas about what the contribution of each is. And you can play with numbers. You could say it should be 1/3 for each, but that's probably not true. And then you can look over time, and there are times when people say the environment is a really strong component, so they would put a high percentage on nurture. I think that in recent years, you see in many places the people who make the nature arguments are banging their drums. So there are people who say it's to a very large extent biological or genetic or developmental. And it raises then the interesting question, and what about the contribution from education? Now, before I share Benner's response, I want to show you a few vignettes, a few little stories, which I think are very helpful in exploring what's going on. This is the first story. This is Rosa Parks, who if I remember it correctly, 1953, boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, in the United States. And in the bus, there were little signs that said white forward, colored rear. And you probably know the story of Rosa Parks. When she was asked to move to the back of the bus, she refused to move. Now, if we think about education through the lens of all these international measurement systems that focus a lot on the skills to read, for example, then you can say, hey, there is something strange here, because there is a very clear written message, white forward, colored rear. But Rosa Parks, for some reason, is unable to respond to that message. So if you think that one important skill is to be able to decode written messages, then you can say this is an example of educational failure, because it looks like Rosa Parks is unable to read. There's more going on, but I'm just going to build up the vignettes. Here is the second story. This is Adolf Eichmann, who in Germany was responsible for the logistics of the concentration camps, how to move people to the concentration camps. He fled to South America, I think to Argentina, after the Second World War, and was captured by the Israeli Secret Service in the early 1960s. And he was brought to a court in Jerusalem. And the whole court case is really interesting. But one interesting thing about this court case is that when Eichmann was asked, are you responsible for the consequences of what you did? He said, no, I am not responsible, because I was only following orders. Now, I don't know how it is in Colombia, but in many countries in Europe, they are very concerned about citizenship education. And they think that schools have an important role to make sure that children and young people know all the laws and all the rules in a society, and learn to act according to them. So there you can say, hey, is Adolf Eichmann an example of successful citizenship education? Because here is someone who knows the rules of his society and obeys them perfectly. Of course, there is something wrong here, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I've taken two historical examples, but the point I'm trying to make, you can also find in the news today. Here's an interesting observation from President Zelensky of the Ukraine, who early on in the war was offered to leave the Ukraine. And he made an interesting response where he said, if I left the Ukraine, I would be alive, but I would no longer be a person. And I find it interesting that he makes a distinction between survival and being a person. And maybe the other thing which I find important to keep reminding myself of, I don't know whether you know this young man, Joshua Wong, who played an important role in the democracy protests in Hong Kong a couple of years ago. And as you can see from his Twitter account, Joshua Wong is currently in prison in Hong Kong because of his participation in protests for democracy. And I think he currently is 23 years of age, and I find it quite remarkable that someone at such a young age takes this on him, you could say. So these stories bring me back to Dietrich Benner, to the question of education. Because to this question, what's the contribution of education compared to the contribution of nature and the contribution of the environment? Benner gives a very remarkable answer where he says, we can disagree about the percentages, but nature and nurture together are always 100%. And the first time I read that, I was confused. I thought, this is really strange. Here is a professor of education, and not a very significant professor of education, who asked the question, what difference does education make? What contribution does it make? And then he seems to say it's nature and nurture, that together is 100%. So he seems to be saying education doesn't contribute anything at all. But after reading what he wrote a couple of times, I began to see that he makes a really important point, where he says, of course, as human beings, as we are here today, we are all the outcome of a particular combination of biological talents and factors and environmental influences that allows us to speak particular languages, that allows us to be who we are. But then Benner says the educational question is not a question how this mix happens. That's maybe a question for developmental psychologists or sociocultural theorists. He says education is concerned with the question how, as I put it here in a bit odd English, how an I can step forward from that. How you can say a person can step forward out of a particular mix of nature and nurture. And I think that is a really important insight, where he says the educational question is of a different order. It's not the question of natural development. It's not the question of cultural and social influences, but it's the question of the person, the I, who steps forward from that. So you can say he goes as far as saying the educational question is not about how these natural and social factors determine who we become, who we are, and probably not even about how we can influence these factors. He says that educators, we are doing something else. He uses a German phrase which is very precise. So if any of you reads or understands German, the phrase is Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, and you can say it's to summon someone to self-action. And that's not about saying to our students, be yourself, but it's to say to our students, be a self, be a person. And to locate the educational question there, I think is helpful and important and very significant. And I'll talk a bit more about it, but you can say that this is important, and if you forget this, then you quite easily can misunderstand what is at the heart of education. Now, someone like Benner writes big books about that. I tend to write thinner books. But if you really want to capture it in very simple language, I would say what we do as educators is that we knock on the door of our students and we ask if anyone is there. That is the most basic picture. So if there's anything you want to remember from this talk I'm giving, this idea that we sort of knock on the door of our students and ask, is anyone there? That's at the heart of education. And then if we go back to the stories of Eichmann and Parks, you can suddenly see how these stories get a very different meaning. Because when the lawyers knocked on Eichmann's door and said, Eichmann, is there someone there who is responsible and who wants to be responsible for the consequences of his action? Eichmann actually says, no, I'm not here. There is no one here to take this responsibility. Very strange to say that, actually. There is no one here. And Rosa Parks did the opposite. Of course she could read. Of course she understood the message and consequences of the message. But at that point she said, I am here. I step forward. I no longer want to be part of a society where there is this separation between the whites and the colored people. So suddenly she brings her I to the fore, whereas Eichmann actually denies that he is I. In a sense, that's the point I want to put on the table in this presentation, to say, as educators, our question is not a question of biology or developmental psychology or social cultural theory. As educators, our question is an existential question. The question how we as human beings try to exist and how we can encourage our students to exist and not forget their existence. This is not the question of who we are or how we become who we are. For that we have a word, identity, but I want to argue that identity is not this educational question. Because we all have identities, and identities are messy and in development, and that's all there, and that's fine. But you can say the educational question is the question how we are, how we try to live our lives, how we try to exist. You can say it's the question what we will do with how we have become, with our identity, with what we have learned, with our capacities, our competencies. But when you ask the question in this way, you can say the question how we are, how we try to live our lives, also has to reckon with our inabilities, our blind spots, our incompetencies. So we shouldn't think that we first learn and develop and acquire all kinds of competencies, and then when we are perfectly formed, then we can begin to act. We always could do more, learn more, become better at things, but we meet situations where we have to respond. So you can say the educational question, this existential question, is the question how we try to live our lives when it matters, when we encounter situations where we find a question. Eichmann got this question, Eichmann, were you responsible for this? Rosa Parks meets suddenly the situation where she realizes, should I just go with the rules or should I stop doing that? So these situations are often not the situations we can choose, but they are the situations that come to us, that enter our life's journey, that interrupt our life's journey. For that, we need a different word, and the word I use in my own work is the word subjectness, where you can say the educational question is about how we try to exist as subject of our own lives, not as object of what other people want from us. And again, you can say Eichmann was happy to exist as object, just following rules, stepped forward as subject. So if you want to, I'm just trying to give different descriptions of the same point. You can say, if you want to put it on a t-shirt, you can do it like this. The educational question is the question of the I, but not the I as it tries to just be interested in itself, but the I as it tries to exist in the world and with the world. So this is the first point I wanted to share with you. And as I said, this is the main idea that I'm also suggesting. Pedagogía is strongly, intrinsically connected to this particular question. The work we do as educators always needs to come back to this question. If you can sort of follow what I'm trying to do, so I hope that it makes some sense also in translation. I see Cristina nodding, so good. Thank you. Then, of course, we can look back and look at this world of education policy and practice and research, and we can ask, is this question somewhere in contemporary education? And then I'm not sure. I think this question is constantly being squeezed out, is constantly being moved to the margins. And one way in which that is happening is precisely where I started my talk, where I said I see too much what you could call curriculum-centered conceptions of education that says the point of the school is to get knowledge into students, get learning outcomes, measure those learning outcomes, and get the whole thing under control. Now we have to be mindful that we do not say this is all nonsense. The school is an important place to help children and young people to get into knowledge and understanding, to get into skills and competencies and all that. So there is a job to do, but I think this job has become far too big and has become understood in a very narrow, control-like way. And you can say these good intentions, that we do want to share knowledge and understanding with our students, that we want to equip them the best we can. That becomes a problem when students can no longer be there as human beings, as subjects, but when increasingly they become objects that we are constantly pushing and pulling and measuring, and we're no longer interested in where they are themselves in relation to them. And I see this ongoing, you can call objectification of education going on in many countries, many settings and many systems. Even also where I think that there is a trend where we ask our students to objectify themselves. Again, I don't know how it is in your context, but in the countries I come regularly, I now hear a lot about students should regulate themselves, that they should be owners of their own learning. And there is something odd there. If you have to regulate yourself, the problem is that then you become a manager of yourself, and you are asked to make yourself into an object that you then start to control. So I worry about many of these developments where I think the student is increasingly becoming an object. And there you can say the whole educational question it's marginalized or squeezed out of education. Now, one response to this is to say we need to turn education around. We should move away from measurement and trying to control students. We should rather think of the school as a place where students can express themselves, can make their own sense, be creative, generate their own meaning, articulate their own identity. You probably recognize these trends as well. Quite often, the arts are used here to say the arts provide all these opportunities for children to express themselves and be creative and find their identity. People argue that what we need is not curriculum-centered education, but child-centered education, student-centered education. And in many countries, I also see all kinds of practices of alternative education that really try to do the opposite of the measuring and the testing. But here I also worry, because if we just say education should be the place where students can express and find their voice and find their identity and develop all their talents, we are forgetting to ask a simple, but again, I would say profoundly educational question, the question, what if? And this is maybe the second thing I hope you will remember from this talk. Always asking the what if question. What if the voice of the student or the voice of the teacher is racist? What if the creativity is destructive? What if the identity is only interested in itself? And there I often worry when people get excited and say expression, creativity, identity, and then it will all be wonderful. Because I think the real work we need to do there as educators is to raise the question whether what is emerging in the lives of our students will help them or hinder them in their attempts to exist as subject of their own life. And that is far more difficult work than just to say the school needs to be a place where everyone can express and be who they want to be. Because if we're honest, we know that we have beautiful parts, but we also have things in us that are not going to help to live well together. So to bring this question into play is really important. But of course, it's not us educators who have the answers to this question. And the best we can do is to bring this question to the educational setting and hope that it will become a living question for the children we teach, for the students we try to educate. That, I think, is this real work of encouraging and summoning our students to be a self and not just to be yourself. And one way in which you can try to describe what we try to do there as educators is that we try to arouse a desire in our students for wanting to exist in the world in a grown-up way. And I want to say a few things about existing in the world and existing in a grown-up way. But for me, this already means that education cannot be curriculum-centered, education cannot be child-centered, but education should actually be world-centered, because it's in the world that we can exist as human beings. And if we only focus on getting the curriculum into the students, then we forget that the students are human beings who need to figure out how to live their lives. If we only talk about flourishing and development, but forget that the world puts real limits and limitations on that, we are not asking the educational question. So it has something to do with our existence in the world. Let me say a few things about existing in the world to give that some more profile, and a bit about this idea of grown-upness. And then I'll end with talking a bit about the qualities that I think are important for this. So existing in the world, you can say, has something to do with encountering resistance. What is quite special, I think, about us as human beings is that we are beings who can take initiative. We can, as Hannah Arendt says, we can begin. We can start something. We can have a good idea, or we can try to act in a particular way. And sometimes when we have an idea and we follow through the idea, the world is there and the world resonates well with our ideas. But quite often, the world offers resistance. An example I really like is, for example, when you have a piece of clay and you have an idea of what you want to make out of that clay and you begin to move the clay, you can very often find that what you would like to do with the clay is not possible. So you want to make a very thin, high vase, and you find out that the clay constantly falls back. So what you need to do is to meet the resistance, you can say, that the clay is offering you. And in encountering that resistance, you can say, you can begin to realize that the world is real, and that the world is not just a construction, but that it exists independently of you. So the encounter with resistance is really important. And then you can ask, what do we do when we encounter resistance? Because resistance is, in a sense, frustrating. You have a lovely idea, you try, and then it doesn't work out. One thing you can do when you meet resistance, when something doesn't work out, is that you try to push harder. That you say, I think this idea is really good, and if the clay doesn't allow me to do it, I'll keep working on it until the clay obeys me and my idea. Now, sometimes this is really important for things to happen. So sometimes we need to push harder. But we should be mindful that if we push too hard, we may begin to destroy the very world in which we try to arrive. So you can say, in our encounter with the world and with the resistance of the world, if we push too hard, we could destroy the world. The other response to this frustration of meeting the resistance of the world is that we say, oh, the world is too difficult for me. I step back, I give up. Now, sometimes that's important because to step back and say, maybe this is not what I should be doing, that allows other things to happen. But again, if you step back completely, if you say the world is too difficult and I don't want to be in the world, then ultimately you destroy yourself. You destroy the possibility for you to exist in the world. So you can say, if we try to get too strong a grip on the world disappears. If we walk away from the world, we disappear. So the real challenge, you can say the existential challenge of our lives, is to always try to stay somewhere in the middle ground between not doing too much, but also not too little. And that is quite a challenge, where you can say we try to come into a dialogue with the world, not as a conversation, but as a way of staying with what is other. And that challenge is a lifelong challenge. In each situation, there is the question, how much do I go in and how much do I let the world come back, and can we find a way of existing together? Not just with clay, not just with our living planet, but of course also in meeting other human beings, where exactly the same question arises. That you can say is what it means to exist in the world. So that's not a simple way of sitting down, but it's to try to stay in that middle ground. And you can say that shows how the world is an educational space, because the world, in a sense, teaches you that you're not alone in the world, that you're not in the center of the world. So you can maybe begin to see that if this matters, then there is important educational work to do. Existing in the world in a grown-up way, I think a notion of grown-upness is really important to make sense of education as well. Now, grown-upness is a strange word because it suggests a process of growth, and there are other words in English. There's also the word maturation. That all seems to suggest we develop and then at some point we're grown up. I think that is not a good way to think about grown-upness. I think grown-upness is precisely this quality of trying to be in the middle ground. The French educational writer Philippe Mérieux says to try to exist in the grown-up way is to be in the world, but not to think that you're the center of the universe, that everything just is about you. So it has something to do with asking the question whether what you desire, whether what you would like to do, whether that actually is what you should be doing, whether that is desirable for your own life, for your life with others, for our lives on a planet that cannot just give us everything we desire. That question, is what I desire, is that what I should be desiring, is a difficult question because it interrupts. It interrupts who you are, it interrupts where you are, it interrupts where and how you want to be. But you can say again, that is what it means to exist in a grown-up way, to give space for those interruptions and not just to think about yourself. That's not about getting rid of your desires, but it's to look for the desires that can help to exist in the world without being in the center of the world. So that you can say there is space for you and space for the world. If that's the grown-up way of existing, you can also begin to see what the opposite is. We could use the word infantile for that, but not in order to give children a bad name, because I think the biggest examples of infantile ways of being in the world are people like Donald Trump, who lives in his own fantasy, and I think has never really been interrupted, has never really pondered this question whether what he desires is actually what he should be desiring. So it's a sad and massive example of someone who is unable to even have a sense of what it means to exist in a grown-up way. Whereas I meet many children and young people who really have that sense. So it's not a matter of age, and sometimes the opposite. So if this gives an indication of what actually the challenge is for us human beings to exist in the world in a grown-up way, then you can ask what kind of qualities in education, in educational practices, in educational settings are important for this? What kind of qualities should we highlight and be mindful of and actually value? One, I think, is interruption. We should acknowledge that precisely to exist in a grown-up way in the world means that you take interruptions seriously. The interruption of your desires, the interruption of just being interested in yourself, the interruption of identity. I think there's a really big discussion to have there, because we suffer in our times from the idea that we all can have a perfect identity. And I think that's a dangerous idea. So interruption, you can say, as educators, has something to do with bringing resistance into the lives of our students, and as parents to bring resistance into the lives of our children. It's very important to understand that not all interruptions are educational. You can say punishment is also an interruption, but it's an uneducational interruption. It destroys the soul of the child. But the interruptions that help the child to meet the world and explore what it means to stay in dialogue with the world, those are the ones that can help with this task of trying to exist in a grown-up way. So you can say it's about interruptions that open a space in which the I of the student can step forward. And I'm aware that the language is quite metaphorical, theoretical, but hopefully you can get a bit of a sense of what those could look like. Giving a student a piece of clay, to stay with that example, is precisely to open up a space where the I of the student can step forward, not the I that just has an idea, but the I that encounters the clay and the idea and begins to work in that interaction. I know that in many countries there are concerns about equality and equality of opportunity. I just want to highlight that precisely this is an equalizing gesture. The invitation to be an I, to be a self, is, you can say, the same question for all of us. And that puts a very different angle on the whole question of equality and inequality in education. We may want to come back to that. I'm almost finished looking at the clock. A second quality, I use the word suspension, which means something like slowing down. It's to understand that these processes, they take time. They cannot be done quickly. They need their own time, you could say. And as educators, we need to make that time. We need to create the spaces and the forms where our students can meet the world, meet themselves, meet their desires, and get into working through all that. Gert Spivak has this nice phrase of education as the rearrangement of desires. And you can say that's the slow work we try to do there. There are educators who really understand the need for this very particular slowness. And here are two of the educators from the history of 20th century European education who really understand the time that all this needs, Korczak and A.S. Neill. So interruption, suspension, and then the third quality, I use the English word sustenance, which means support, but it also means nourishment, food, you could say. If our job as educators is to try to hold our students in this difficult middle ground where they really can meet the world in themselves and work through that, they deserve our support and they need nourishment in order to be able to stay there. And we can take this in a very literal way. I taught for years with a colleague who always brought food to the classroom, which was fantastic. She always had fruit and biscuits and water and tea. And it was such an important gesture, I think. We need to provide this sustenance because quite often this point where we try to get our students is very difficult and unattractive in the short term, but we always hope that it can become meaningful and significant in the longer term. And it shows again something of the difficulty of what we have to do. Why am I highlighting these three qualities? Because I think they go against the trend I see again and again of fast personalized learning, where people say the best students are the ones that go the fastest. The best education is the personalized trajectory where you only focus on yourself. And I think interruption, suspension, and sustenance go in the opposite direction, where you say, no, you stay together, which means that you will be slowed down by some other student. That is the time that we need, and the students who go very fast are probably the ones who are not paying attention. And also, as I said before, this mantra that students should take responsibility for their own learning, that very easily forgets that we as educators have a job to support our students, to hold them in the educational space. So you can really ask if these qualities matter, and we then begin to look back at our educational institutions. Is there still time for these qualities? Is there still time, you can say, I put it here for the time of the school, because what I really like about the Greek word school, schola, is that it means free time. Not in the sense of leisure time, but then in the sense of time that is not yet claimed by the economy or not yet claimed by the government, but the time we make free precisely to the new generation to step into their own existence. Time we make available for them to meet the world and themselves, the time for trying to be at home world. And I often worry that the school no longer has a sense that it is this precious time. So if we talk about education and emancipation, I tend to think the school itself needs to be emancipated from too much control and too much grip so that it can be this other kind of time. And in my latest book, I say, so often we hear this question, what kind of school does society need? And we forget to ask, what kind of society does the school actually need? What is society doing so that this time of the school is possible? And the school is not just a big machine. So you get a sense that I'm quite passionate about some of these ideas because I think they are important, and I remain sad when I see education practices that go in the opposite direction, and we need to begin to find ourselves in the middle. It's all that ultimately a matter of understanding. A lot of people would say, yes, in education, we try to help our students to come to understanding, to sense making, to look at the world and say, what does this mean? How can I make sense of it? And that's part of what we do. But I conclude with another sentence from Hannah Arendt, actually the longer sentence from what I have mentioned before, because somewhere in the text, Hannah Arendt writes about understanding, but she says, what is understanding? That is not making sense. Understanding is an unending activity, a lifelong challenge, you could say, by which in constant change and variation, there is not a predefined path, but in constant change and variation, we come to terms with and reconcile ourselves to reality. That is, try to be at home in the world. And I find it quite fascinating that she says understanding is not to come to sense or meaning, but it's this lifelong challenge to step into the world and try to be there and try to be at home there. And for me, that's very valuable at all kinds of levels, because a lot of education focuses on these questions. How can I make sense of the world? How can I learn about the world? But I think there is a question in the opposite direction, not what I want from the world, but maybe what the world is asking of me, what the world is trying to say to me, what the world is trying to teach me. And for me, somewhere there, I think there is a very different educational question that puts the world and what the world asks of us in the center, and that hangs around this, which is both an invitation and a challenge to try to be at home in the world and exist there as subject of our own lives and not as objects of all the forces who are not interested in us, but in all kinds of other things. So not too much sense making, and maybe a bit more life. That would be the simple way to summarize what I tried to say. I'm very grateful for your attention, and I know there was an awful lot already in this presentation. I hope we have some time for some questions and reflections. I write too much, and then I'm also grateful when people translate that in other languages, and there are 3 of my books soon also available in Spanish. And it's not because I want to sell books, but it's because I think I care for the human dimension of education, and wherever we can keep that in focus, I think we should try to make an effort doing that. I'll stop there. Thanks for listening silently, but that was probably because all your microphones were switched off anyway.
Muchas gracias, profesor Gert. Muy sugerentes. Ok, perfecto. Muchas gracias nuevamente, profesor Gert, por acompañarnos en esta mañana y para nosotros mañana, para usted tarde, con estas sugerentes ideas para pensar, diríamos, el asunto central. Como usted lo decía, en nuestras tradiciones hablamos de pedagogía y bueno, tal vez la problematización, el concepto fundamental es justamente el de educación, y tenemos que volver a pensar esos asuntos nodales para la educación. Mientras que las personas que nos acompañan registran algunos de sus comentarios y preguntas, les compartimos un enlace donde pueden ustedes allí registrar sus comentarios y preguntas, voy a plantear algunos aspectos que yo creo, profesor, que podríamos ampliar de esto que usted nos plantea, que creo que recoge también algunos elementos que en otros de sus trabajos usted ha venido planteando y que aquí se concentran de manera muy interesante en esta idea de pensar la educación, ¿no? ¿Qué es lo central de la educación? ¿Cuáles son esos malentendidos que a la hora de hablar de educación encontramos en el debate no solo de los países europeos, sino en general en el campo de la pedagogía? Y son esas preguntas más centradas en las competencias, en los aprendizajes, en la calidad, las que tal vez no nos dejan ver esos asuntos que, como usted dice, tienen que ver con el centro, con lo nodal y con la necesidad de volver a pensar, dice usted, como la idea del World Centered, ¿no? Como centrar en el mundo la tarea de la educación. Y en esa vía hay algunas ideas que quisiera que tal vez nos amplíe de esta conversación, ¿no? En primer lugar, creo que este planteamiento nos ayuda a pensar el porqué de la educación, ¿no? ¿Por qué distinguir la tarea de la educación de otras prácticas como la crianza o ese determinismo que usted planteaba entre las condiciones sociales o culturales y las condiciones biológicas, ¿no? Esa forma de entender lo humano en esas dos oposiciones y más bien pensar ese lugar de la educación como ese entre, ¿no? Como ese lugar que reconoce esos dos asuntos, pero que nos propone como una vía intermedia, que es esta vía de volver a centrar, volver a pensar el mundo, ¿no? Y esa relación de los individuos con el mundo. Entonces, ¿por qué volver a pensar la educación, no? Cuando hoy algunos están hablando del fin de la educación o ya desde hace algunos años, incluso Hannah Arendt ya nos venía anunciando esa crisis de la educación, ¿no? Entonces, ¿por qué volver a pensar? ¿Por qué volver a pensar la educación se convierte en un asunto central para nuestro campo? Otra idea que tal vez nos resulta muy sugerente tiene que ver con la idea de las resistencias. Usted propone que en este encuentro con el mundo se produce una resistencia que puede tener dos efectos, o de autodestrucción o de destrucción del mundo. En todo caso, nos encontramos con una resistencia. Y me gustaría que ampliara ese concepto o esta idea, ¿no? que usted sitúa más en términos existenciales, ¿no? De la forma de existencia del humano en el mundo, distinguiéndola de tal vez miradas más ideologizadas, ¿no? Porque cuando hablamos del concepto de resistencia, en ocasiones suele estar articulada a unas miradas, digámoslas así, politizadas, ¿no? Unas miradas ideológicas o ideologizadas sobre lo que significa la resistencia. Pero acá me parece que usted nos propone otra vía para entender la resistencia, ¿no? Como incluso algo con lo que nos encontramos quienes educamos a otro, ¿no? Y también con las resistencias mismas de un mundo que bueno, va en unos horizontes bien distintos. Y bueno, para solo iniciar, el otro punto sobre el cual me gustaría que ampliase es el lugar de la escuela. Porque sería tal vez ese lugar en el que usted privilegia estas tres estas tres propuestas, ¿no? Estas tres posibilidades de construir el encuentro, ¿no? El entre del que hablaba. La interrupción, la suspensión y el dar sustento, ofrecer a los nuevos unas condiciones para constituirse en adultos, sería posible en el escenario escolar. Entonces, también la escuela está plagada, atravesada por discursos que le impiden situar lo fundamental de la escuela, que sería esta tarea, ¿no? Esta sería la tarea de la escuela por excelencia, pero hay otras demandas sociales, demandas de énfasis en el aprendizaje, de énfasis en la calidad, de énfasis en los resultados de aprendizaje, ¿no? Que impiden que estos tres asuntos tengan lugar. En ese orden de ideas, bueno, ¿por qué situar entonces la escuela como ese lugar privilegiado donde esto puede ocurrir, cuando hoy pues hablamos de otros escenarios educativos, pero por qué la escuela sigue siendo un lugar privilegiado para estos asuntos? Bueno, lo voy dejando hasta acá. Entre tanto, recojo algunas inquietudes del público.
Thanks for those reflections. Yeah, we'll see if there are other questions. I think the theme of resistance is an important one, and of course the word can be in a number of places. The world offers resistance to what we want, but of course we as human beings can also offer resistance to what comes to us, and that's political action. And I think both dimensions of resistance are in what I try to present. I think the reason to highlight that the world offers resistance, the natural world, the social world, is to go against the neoliberal worldview that constantly tries to tell us there are no limits, we can do everything we want, and if there are any limits, we will have technology to solve those limits in the future. And I think that's actually a very infantile worldview, to say there are no limits. And you can see with the ecological crisis what the problem of the consequences of that message have been. And with the democratic crisis, I think we see the same, that we no longer understand that democracy is not that everyone can just say what they want to say and get what they want to get, but that democracy is precisely to come to terms with the fact that we have to live together, and that put limits on what each of us as individual or group can do. So there, I think, to say resistance is not a hindrance, but resistance is actually to meet reality and to meet the challenge of coming to terms with reality, is the opposite of neoliberal tendencies, to use that word, that constantly tell us that there are no limits. At the same time, the whole question of the school brings also this other dimension of resistance in, where you can say the school suffers from having to solve all the problems of society. If there is a societal problem, quite often the school gets another task. And there, I think there is also a duty for the school to offer resistance and say, look, the school is school. It's very precious time. The school is not the problem solver for all of society's problems. the school needs to have some time of its own as well. And I think that's the other kind of resistance to offer. So thanks for highlighting those, different layers and directions of resistance.
Ok, bueno, profesor. Aquí hay algunas inquietudes frente a la idea de cómo enfrentar el sistema de evaluación, ¿no? Porque resulta casi ineludible tener que atender al requerimiento de la evaluación, ¿no? Pero cómo enfrentar, cómo atender ese requerimiento de la evaluación, pero redimensionar también esas miradas que hacemos a la evaluación.
I think, if I understand your comment and question well, there are different ways to respond to it. So yes, as educators, we meet all kind of demands and expectations and all kind of ways in which our work is being regulated. And I think one thing that remains really important is that we keep asking whether all those systems are necessary, whether they are there for the good or whether they just have become an aim in themselves. And for that, as educators, we need to be able to articulate what education is. And if people say, but education is that you as teacher produce learning outcomes that we can measure, then we should be able to say, no, that's a misunderstanding of education. It's actually a destruction of education. So it begins there, and therefore I think that the whole question of the misunderstanding of education tries to speak to that. It partly also goes back to Parks and Eichmann, where you can say, as educators, we meet this really difficult question again and again. Should we just say yes to all these systems? Or is there a point where we have to stand up and say, no longer, this no longer makes sense? That can be very difficult to do as an individual teacher. Therefore, I think questions of professional solidarity, collective resistance are important. And that begins with having a discourse and a conversation where we are talking about these problems. And of course, what a lot of systems do is they try to take all the time we have so that we have no time left to ask the really important questions. And there, I think it's also important to keep pushing back in ways that we can. In my own teaching, I do that a lot. And maybe I can manage to do that because of the kind of person I am, or there are all kind of explanations for it. But I often find that there is more scope to push back or not to obey all the systems than what sometimes is thought. And yeah, we can talk more about this. The response I always try to give if I meet a system that is stupid is to come up with something better. Not simply to say I don't like this, but actually to say I have something better here. And I'll do that and I'll show you that it's better. And these are little acts of resistance that maybe are possible. And it's of course very difficult to speak for other countries and other regimes and settings. But I do believe that if we understand that education has at its heart a humanizing imperative, that's at the heart of what we do, then we need to look at everything we encounter in light of that. But therefore, it's important that we also keep developing the languages that allow us to speak along those lines. You can say to speak pedagogia back to systems of measurement and objectification. So I think language matters as well, and practice also matters. And I'm slightly optimistic that there is more possible if we keep encouraging each other to take that more, not because we want more as individuals, but for the sake of the mission of education, if I can use that word carefully.
Thank you. Otra de las inquietudes tiene que ver, hay dos inquietudes. La primera, en esta distinción que usted nos propone entre naturaleza y crianza, si es posible pensar la educación como un lujo, ¿no? Un lujo de la especie humana, tal vez. Y una siguiente pregunta, estaría interesada, una persona estaría interesada en que usted nos amplíe esta distinción entre la adultez y la infancia, si el criterio no es cronológico, el que marca la distinción entre infancia y adultez, ¿cuál sería el criterio? ¿Qué sería lo que nos ayuda a distinguir la infancia de la adultez?
Okay, I'll begin with the second question, and then I need to come back to the first question. The thing I'm trying to suggest is that we don't think of child and adult as chronological categories, but what I try to do is to say there are two ways in which we can exist as human beings. The infantile way, where we simply, you can say, run behind our desires, and the grown-up way, where we always return to this question, is what I desire or what I encounter as a desire, is that what I should be desiring? And sometimes the answer to that is yes, and sometimes the answer will be no. And then you can say what is the difference between those two ways of existing? And you could almost say with an old word, it's the difference between having a conscience and not having a conscience. Because conscience, if you play a bit with the language, is something like it's a second knowing. And you can say to have a conscience doesn't mean that you have strong values and know what's wrong and right, but it's actually that you always carry a moment of doubt with you. Always want to bring back the question, is what I want to do, what I think I should be doing, is that what I should be doing? That for me marks the difference between the grown-up and the non-grown-up way of being in the world. And then I find it shocking that so many adults never live with that question. And I find it so impressive that young children are perfectly able to exist in that way, where they are not just a slave of their desires, where you actually see how they stand in that middle ground. Not always sort of, young children, not always completely aware of it. But you can see very impressive examples of that. And that's, in a sense, how I want to make the distinction. to push back against a very negative view of children and a far too positive view of adults. And I think when you look carefully, you will often find the opposite. That children are able to exist in decentered ways and many adults aren't. And there is important work to do, but it begins with that observation. So that's how I'm trying to make the distinction. And again, what I'm doing there is also to say these are existential questions, not developmental questions. And I think that again shows how you can look at that as an educator, not the developmental psychologist will probably see something else. The first question, is it possible to repeat that? Because I didn't completely got it.
Bueno, acá hay otra pregunta. Usted nos propuso llegar a ser persona como el propósito de la educación. Este es un concepto que podría estar vinculado a la tradición cristiana y romana. ¿Cómo podemos entender este concepto de este propósito de la educación hoy? Y si este análisis podemos plantearlo como que deviene de esta tradición cristiana y romana.
My first response would be to say, if that tradition can help us to get a good sense of what the challenge is to exist as human being, then that's great. But I do think that there are many more traditions and sources that keep coming back to this point. So I wouldn't immediately say it's Roman or it's Christian, although you can find, in some Christian traditions, the idea of the person and the philosophy of the person is very well developed and articulated and also taken up in educational theory. The word person is Greek and actually means mask. And that person is the word for the Greek word for mask is because when theater players in Greek theater had a mask in front of their face in order to play a character, their voice came through the mask. And literally person means pers sonora, and I guess that gets close to Spanish as well, the voice that comes through. So there are interesting things about even the word person here. But so you will have seen the word I use is subject. And what I value about the word subject, which is a Latin word, is that it has a double meaning. The subject in a sentence in grammar is the one who does the action. So you can say we are subject in that we can act. But the beautiful thing I like about subject is that it also means to be subjected. And although we can act, although we can begin, although we can take initiative, we are always subjected to what other people or the world brings back to us. So if I say I have a brilliant idea and the piece of clay says, but that's not going to happen, then we experience what it means to exist as subject, because it means that we are subjected to a world outside of us, and our existence happens in that encounter. And there you can say that being careful, indigenous worldviews, where world speaks, where the individual is not in the center in which you find that in Western Enlightenment, I think also really helps with articulating what it means to exist as subject in your life. Precisely not as the one who is in control. I think that's the lie of neoliberalism. But as the one who, in a sense, is willing to step into the world and be subjected to all that the world there does to us. So I can see indeed connections to many traditions that help here. But I would highlight that precisely in this moment of being subjected, we find very other ideas than sort of Western ideas of rational individuality.
Bueno, ya vamos terminando. Pero no quisiera que cerremos nuestra sesión sin retomar alguna idea que en otro momento usted había planteado frente a la necesidad de pensar teóricamente la educación. Y me interesa en particular porque tenemos entre nuestra audiencia profesores y estudiantes de programas de formación en nuestro campo, en la pedagogía o en algunos países de ciencias de la educación. Y una de las preguntas que usualmente aparecen tiene que ver con esta tensión entre la teoría y la práctica. Como si hubiese un divorcio entre teoría y práctica cuando se trata de la aproximación al campo de la pedagogía. Y en alguno de los textos que usted escribía con algunos colegas, planteaba la necesidad de pensar teóricamente estos asuntos, y es una apuesta que hemos venido consolidando con los colegas de América Latina que nos hemos reunido para estudiar y volver a digamos, actualizar los problemas centrales de la educación, de la pedagogía. Entonces quisiera que tal vez en esa vía nos planteara algunos, digamos, el porqué de esta necesidad de pensar teóricamente la educación. Como usted lo dice, a veces nos enfrentamos a planteamientos que parecen muy abstractos, que no tienen mucho que ver con la vida cotidiana de maestros y alumnos, pero que por el contrario tienen todo que ver, porque cuando hablamos de educación hablamos de la existencia justamente de esos nuevos y viejos en el mundo. Entonces, bueno, quisiera que nos plantee algunos aspectos vinculados a esa idea.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. It's funny that people sort of keep referring to this gap between theory and practice in education. And this has been going on for not just for decades, but for centuries. And a lot of people say, oh, we need to close the gap and it's a problem. I've come to the conclusion, no, this is what it is. And there is something odd, but this belongs to education, that we constantly are in this tension that education is very practical. I think that's entirely true. As teachers, we have to be in the situation and be there. And at the same time, there is theoretical reflection that people often say, well, it's abstract and it's disconnected from practice. But I think that the reason for good theory or to keep studying is in order to be able to be in the practice in different ways. Maybe two things to mention. One is a very old idea from one of the originators of education as an academic discipline in Germany, Friedrich Herbart, who has this idea that the relationship between theory and practice in education is, because it's topological. So you can say theory in education doesn't tell you what to do, but it gives you a map. It gives you a description of where you are. And depending on the map with which you travel, you will be able to travel in different ways. If the map you have about being in a classroom is to produce learning outcomes, then you will act and be there very differently than if the map with which you travel as a teacher is the map of Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, of helping your students not to forget that they are the self, that there are knocks on their door and that they then need to figure out whether they say there is no one here or there is someone. So you can say the importance of theory is to try to be as close as possible to what is in front of you as a teacher. And that's the most difficult thing to do, to be close to what's happening in front of you, because quite often we are not meeting what is there, but we are meeting what we think that is there. And what theory can do is, in a sense, help us to become not just better observers, but to try to see what is in front of us. And I was thinking of Pablo Picasso, who says that the whole ambition of his career is to be able to see as a child. And you can say that's also the whole endeavor of theory in education. It's we need to work through all this in order to be able to see exactly what is happening there, rather than that all kind of ideas tell us what is happening there. So there is something odd about theory, but I think there is something really important that we and that comes back to the title of my talk. There are so many misunderstandings that are very seductive. And you can say the challenge is, can we figure out what it means to understand rather than to misunderstand education? So it's somewhere there that I think that we shouldn't think theory is a luxury. Theory we do when we have time. I think good theory is, in a sense, quite urgent, because if we don't work together to stay attentive, then other discourses will tell us what is happening, and then very quickly education leaves the classroom.
Bueno, nos deja incitados a seguir conversando y pensando estos asuntos. Por fortuna, este evento abre la puerta para continuar con asuntos que pues tienen que ver con nuestro quehacer profesional y con nuestros intereses. Y le agradezco enormemente su disposición a participar en nuestro encuentro. Esperamos que en una próxima ocasión podamos tenerlo aquí en Colombia, acompañándonos, porque, bueno, como siempre...
That would be nice, yeah.
Yes. Porque este es, por supuesto, un medio maravilloso para el encuentro, pero nada reemplaza a la presencialidad, y bueno, es la apuesta que también esperamos el próximo año poder habilitar en este encuentro. No me quiero despedir antes. Bueno, primero, no sé si tiene algunas palabras finales, profesor Gert, y bueno, ya les quiero contar un poco de manera muy Ujú.
Yeah, just to say thank you so much again for the invitation, for allowing me to share some ideas, for bring that into the conversation, and I hope you will have a wonderful time together the rest of today and the coming days. And yeah, I hope that with good theory we can manage to keep what matters really in focus. And I do hope at one point that we can sit at the same table.
Thank you. Ok, bueno, les quiero contar de qué se tratan las actividades esta semana que iniciamos hoy con esta maravillosa conferencia del profesor Gert. En la tarde, tanto el día de hoy como el día de mañana, vamos a tener unos talleres, 7 talleres que están ofertados por colegas de 4 países de América Latina: Colombia, México, Argentina y Brasil. Ustedes pudieron hacer la inscripción previa a estos espacios, así que, bueno, esperamos que puedan participar activamente de estos espacios. El día de mañana vamos a continuar nuestra conversación con una conferencia que va a estar a cargo de la profesora Alejandra Virgin de Argentina, y bueno, va a conversar sobre un tema fundamental para todos nosotros, que es esta relación entre pedagogía y formación de maestros, que ha sido uno de los campos claves de la producción teórica sobre la pedagogía y práctica, por supuesto. El día jueves vamos a tener un panel a propósito de la pregunta por la transmisión, y hemos invitado a 2 colegas, Carmen Rodríguez de Uruguay, Guillermo Bustamante de Colombia, que van a estar acompañados por el profesor Carlos Valenzuela. Y bueno, queremos pensar nuevamente estas preguntas por la transmisión, por la tradición. Son asuntos que van a estar en juego en ese panel. En la tarde, el jueves, vamos a cerrar nuestro seminario internacional de estudios en pedagogía, donde hemos venido adelantando reflexiones sobre los conceptos centrales para la pedagogía. En esta última sesión vamos a tener la participación de los profesores Claudio Dal Bosco de Brasil y Dora Marín de Colombia, para cerrar el análisis sobre el concepto de formación. Y por último, el viernes vamos a cerrar nuestra semana con una conferencia del profesor Bernard Charlotte a propósito de esta pregunta entre educación o barbarie, que tiene que ver con uno de sus recientes textos. Entonces, bueno, esta semana va a estar alimentada por diferentes producciones, diferentes preguntas. Vamos a realizarla de manera virtual. A diferencia de esta sesión, todas las demás van a ocurrir a través de YouTube, el YouTube de la ORI. Y bueno, para cerrar quisiera agradecer nuevamente al profesor Gert, agradecer al equipo de traducción que ha estado acompañándonos durante la mañana, especialmente a Eliana de la Oficina de Relaciones Interinstitucionales, que ha sido un apoyo fundamental para el desarrollo de este evento, a los estudiantes del programa en pedagogía que nos van a estar acompañando en distintos escenarios de desarrollo de este evento, y a los colegas de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional de Colombia, de la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional de México, de la Universidad de Paraíba de Brasil, de la Universidad Nacional de Rosario en Argentina y de la Universidad Nacional del Comahue en Argentina también, que han venido acompañando y vinculándose a distintas actividades de este evento. Entonces, bueno, les damos la bienvenida. Esperamos que puedan aprovechar, participar y disfrutar de estos espacios de conversación y de diálogo con colegas de distintos lugares del mundo. Y bueno, agradecerles su participación en esta primera jornada. Los esperamos entonces en las siguientes jornadas y bueno, esperamos pronto tenerlo por acá, profesor Gert. Buena tarde para usted. Ah, ok.